So welcome to everyone. I see lots of friendly faces out there. Um, so let's see. Looks like just about everybody I recognize. So what I normally would do would be to emote friendliness. Indeed. What I would normally do would go, "Welcome to the Science Club or Science Circle." I can still say that, and that I'm going to use voice. You can use text. Please do. I like to see lots of chatter. And I'll answer questions as they come up, all that good stuff like that. The reason I do it as it comes up is so that I don't forget what you asked later, and you don't either. So I like to be involved with the audience. Okay. Um, so let's start on the hour and end on the hour, so to speak, unless there's a lot of stuff still going on. And let's see. Oh, yes, lots of people just showing up there. Great. Okay. So the title of this, the Endorheic Basins, Life in Supersaline Conditions, that's kind of what you see in an article. But in reality, um, okay, Day, hang on to that question. But, organisms can, I don't think cats can any more than we can, but there is when I come up there are some organisms that live in supersaline conditions, and they are able. And I looked it up myself. In fact, actually, this is kind of one of those fun presentations because what I did was I saw a picture kind of like what you see in the title here, and I go, "Good gracious, where's that?" And obviously it must be somewhere shallow, etc. Blah blah. Looked it up, and actually it was a very interesting topic. And that's kind of what I do with science. I'm sure you do too is the yeah, same as us. um, but there are organisms that live in salt water, and they can do it because of a particular physiological thing that they have. The same way they can live in water that is below freezing, that sort of thing. That it's super okay, good. But yeah, you don't want to drink a lot of salt water for, and I'll cover that. So anyway, I saw this picture just like the one in here. I started looking it up and I go, wow, that's a very interesting topic. And I really didn't know much about it. So I started looking up stuff like what you guys are saying. Like, okay, can anybody live in really salt water? And yes, there are organisms that do it. Well, how do they do it? Well, for some of the same reasons that they can live in very, very cold water and things like that. And so, yeah, all of what you guys are saying fits. So I, just like a lot of other science things, I have fun with science. Yes. Okay. There you go. There you go. Okay. So brine shrimp. Ben, actually, I have a picture of brine shrimp. I think I have in here. Hang on. We'll get there in a second. I'm glad you guys are all seabirds like flamingos. Yep. Okay. So you guys are all bringing up some really cool stuff, which is good. And it also tells me whether I've covered some of my topics completely. So hang on to that, and I'll get into the presentation right now. Okay. But this is kind of one of those fun ones where, like I said, I look at a picture and go, oh, what kind of science is behind that? So you may have, when I was young, my um, mom in particular was brought up on classic literature and all that stuff, and so a lot of classic literature and poems and stuff. So I heard this one about water, water everywhere, or a drink to what? No, um, nor any drop to drink, and it was from a poem called "The Rime of the Ancient Mariner," which is about a man who gets stranded in becalmed oceans and can't drink the water even though it's all around him. And so he's slowly dehydrating. Um, sounds like a grand topic for a poem. But in any case, water is, yeah, after killing albatross. which is not, which then again is, a lot of these legends, which killing an albatross is not good luck. Okay, so water is the third most common molecule in the universe. So, in other words, if you look out there, even though the space looks pretty empty, it's not. It's full of all kinds of stuff. And so, where oxygen is the third most common element and hydrogen the first most common element, anybody happen to know what the second most common molecule is? That's an astrophysicist question, but whatever. Water, yeah, excellent. Wow, Sis. So anyway, yeah, well, that's definitely one, and then carbon monoxide I found out is the second. So anyway, uh, water's found just about everywhere. The problem is it's not found in liquid or easily accessible forms. On Earth, there is a lot of water, but perhaps only 1% is available for life. On the moon, it's estimated that there may be as much as 600 billion kilograms, but we don't know yet how much is available for life. In August of this year, the China is going to be launching their seventh, I think it's seventh um, mission since about the time that Science Circle got started, actually in Second Life. And they're specifically going to the South Pole to find water. That's the mission. Okay, so we should be able to answer whether there's actually water and what form there is later in the year. Now, speaking of which, every week on Monday we have a group, science moon-based Saline group, and so water becomes a big deal when we're talking about living on other planets. So, is there any fresh water in the solar system? Well, it's if you're in kind of the Goldilocks zone, as they call it. I'm not sure that everybody is familiar with that story, but the idea is if you're too near to the sun or too small, say Mars size, is that you may have had liquid water at one time. In fact, Venus and Mars both have indications that they had water at one time. Mars, because it's small, it lost its magnetic field because the interior got too solid, and then without the magnetic field, the solar wind stripped off the atmosphere. Without the atmosphere, then essentially the water went away, and so the only water on Mars may be found frozen under the surface, that sort of thing, or around the poles. Venus actually had there's a good article out that showed that the Venus had water, oceans just like the Earth, until about 715 million years ago, and then they had a catastrophic outpouring of carbon dioxide from volcanic events that ended up in a runaway greenhouse. That then, of course, Venus has a very hellish atmosphere or environment today. Now, at about the same time, when we say fresh water, even Earth at some points did not have fresh water. Around 715 million years ago, there was hypothesized to be a snowball Earth where essentially all of the fresh water on Earth was frozen. And then if you're too far out, yeah, there we go, could accelerate. Okay, that's interesting, Sis. Okay. Um, and then again, see anything in the past there, you're going to have to come up with some pretty good. Oh, that's interesting, Sumo. Yeah, in other words, what form does water take? If water then is embedded in the materials in glass beads, that sort of thing, from impact craters. Okay, there you go. Look at tags, detailed stuff from a medical standpoint. Yes, exactly. How saline the oceans were in Earth formation, etc. But if you're too far out in the solar system, then, for example, the water is not going to be liquid because it's too cold, but it can be liquid under a cover. So under a layer of ice, a rather thick layers, kilometers of ice, like under Europa. Europa is actually the smoothest object in the solar system. The reason being is that the surface is renewed by the interaction of a hypothesized water ocean. In fact, it may have more water than Earth does. Um, but we don't know yet. But we may find out sometime. We do know that there's outpourings of salt and other stuff. So essentially, um, water. Okay, etc. Okay, so in other words, fresh water is kind of a rarity. So let's. Anybody remember this from their early high school days or whatever? The water is like okay, so you've got all these things. Now, the interesting thing is to look at this water cycle, and they didn't say anything about the sun. They just said, okay, it evaporates and it condenses and it moves with the wind, and then there's precipitation and condensation and all that good stuff. But you got to have all of these things in order to have a full water cycle. So there's this, yeah. In fact, actually, this is kind of from one of the things. It's from University, Colorado State University. So it's probably in a textbook. And so you have process physics processes where you got warming and cooling and wind and pressure and the shape of things and all that good stuff. And then you got the chemistry, phase changes and airborne life. In fact, rain can't you don't have rain unless it has some sort of a nucleus, whether that's dust or in some cases bacteria and such. In fact, there was a recent article that basically said that every square meter on Earth, in average, has about 4 airborne insects above you, let alone bacteria. So that's why fresh rainwater might not be as fresh. In other words, you might want to clean it up a little bit before you drink it. And then, of course, biology. Yeah. Okay. So all of these types of things that are going on to create the water cycle, including, in other words, if you have any one of these disrupted, you won't have the full water cycle, including the uh, uptake of water from plants and then into the atmosphere, sublimation of snow instead of going to liquid water, sublimation into the air and deposition of frozen precipitation. And you also have infiltration into the surface below, but it has to be sufficient so that it can percolate down. Otherwise, it's going to run off. All of these sorts of things go into it. It's very complicated. Okay, so where is the fresh water? Yeah, exactly. And also on the moon, since we do the moon group for the moon people here, loonies, um, if you mine water on the moon in the form of obviously ice or something, you have to be careful because the moment it warms up, it's going to sublimate away and you're going to lose your ice. So essentially, you have to mine it and then you have to put it in a container. And then otherwise, it's all going to disappear before you can get it back to wherever you want to melt it. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So here is where the fresh water. Yeah, that too. Okay. So here's where the fresh water is. Well, or water is, period, on Earth. Most of it's in the oceans. Some of it's in the atmosphere. A lot of it's in ice and snow still, although that's going to come down, of course, with climate change. A lot of it's in groundwater, not all of it's accessible. And then the part that we actually think of fresh water, where you, uh, well, yeah, fresh saltwater pools, yes, lots of fetid in this case, meaning full of buggies or full of, yeah, buggies. Well, yes, because there are halophilic organisms that love salt water, and they often color the water. And I'm going to get to that here in a minute. You can actually see salt water, blue, not horse drawn buggies. English is fine. So anyway, okay. So let me continue on. Ah, yes, of course. There you go. Okay. In other words, the types of bacteria that might be harmful to us can be delayed by having brine like pickles or heavy concentrations of pickles or sugar as well. Now there's a reason. There's a reason why. Okay, I'll say it anyway. The buggies, the little things that can survive in salt water, do so because they have a lot of things like glycerol and other small neutral molecules inside them that kind of act as the same as antifreeze, except that, in other words, it crowds out or doesn't allow. Now, Tag probably knows more about this, but essentially crowds out. It protects the salt from coming out of or the water from coming out of the cell and drying up, which is essentially what happens. So, in fact, we'll have to talk about that next. So, in other words, they're able to live in more saline conditions because they have molecules within their cells that act somewhat like antifreeze, only it's more like anti-osmosis. In fact, cells need fresh water, as Tagline pointed out, for both structural integrity, in other words, to keep them nice and plump, because you need it for ATP production, you need it. And so cells maintain an equilibrium, a osmoregulation, regulation of osmosis between the inside and the outside. So if you have too high a salt concentration, it's going to shrink the cells, impair their function. They need water to act as a solvent for chemical reactions, to move essential molecules like sugars and salts and stuff into the cell, flush out waste products. I think people have pointed out several of those indicators. Now, what do we mean by salty? Is fresh water uh, is not necessarily salt free, but it has very little salt. However, our blood, in other words, when they do salt IV saline solution, it's actually the same amount of 0.9% or 9 parts per thousand is what we usually use for a dimensions for salt. So blood is actually 0.9%, mostly sodium chloride, some potassium, that sort of thing. Oceans are up to 3.5, but some seas, like the Mediterranean Sea and such, are higher. And then there's other ones which are higher than that. All the way up to the point where water is saturated, which can be as much as the Great Salt Lake, which I will cover in a second. In fact, I need to get past the science in order to share a bit about some of the endorheic basins around the world. I always like to read taglines too, because I like to learn the actual medical side. Okay, keep serving someone has everything. Yes, great. So, well, it has salt and sea. Okay, I'll mention those here. Okay, so let's take a look then. Endorheic basins. Let's just They're not always salt seas, by the way, but an endorheic basin means that it does not have an outlet to the sea or to the ocean. Old salt, exactly. Says it's very quick on the witticisms, but they're on all continents. And so what we'll do is kind of a counterclockwise look at some of the endorheic witticisms. Oh, that's a witticism. Very good. I like reading the chat as much as sharing the stuff. Okay, but that's why I'm here. Otherwise, I'd be talking to myself. I'm talking to my dog. Um, could smile at me and wag its tail, but yeah, I like to have the witticisms. Um, okay, so let's do a counterclockwise look at some of the interesting endorheic basins, which mean they don't have an outlet to the sea, which means just like a cell, essentially there has to be an equilibrium in order to sustain any water. You have to have the source of water, and then you can't have too much evaporation, otherwise you're going to have a salt flat. But not all the endorheic basins are a salt flat. Some are very uh, healthy lakes and things like that. So let's go ahead and check out some of the endorheic basins around the world. Here's one. Australia. Australia is one of the largest endorheic basins in the world. It takes up a good, you can see it takes up a good part of the central eastern part of Australia. It is below sea level. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Some of them are very high in altitude. Some of the endorheic basins are also the lowest places on Earth. They, in this case, Lake Erie, I probably anybody know how to actually pronounce that? Um, Australia. This particular one's not. It's more like think of the Mississippi River in the U.S. In other words, it's simply in the middle of the continent, and so it's kind of been stretched, so to speak. Um, this is not, but there are Shiloh. There are some volcanic basins. I'll get to one here shortly. That's in Turkey that had definitely had some volcanic origins. There are also, but good question. Okay, so Crater Lake, for example, in Oregon in the US and other places, there are lakes in Central America. Um, so Crater Lake is a possibly an endorheic basin. In other words, it doesn't have an outlet, but it's actually called cryptorheic, which means that actually the water drains from the inside and it has to be refilled. And there are other basins like that that are not fully endorheic, which are uh, volcanic lakes. Okay, so any case in Australia, the Lake Erie ranges from completely. Yeah, I know. Since one of the things I thought the reason I gave this presentation is not only it's interesting science, but it has some very strange little tidbits of information. You know, the Aussies, they'll do just about anything. So they actually have this little yacht club where they've got the catamarans with no keel. And so you go skimming across these things, but you can't do a lot of tacking because otherwise stick your, uh, you're going to stick your bow in the mud and go head over heels, I think. So anyway, Lake Erie has three times in the last 150 years, it's actually been full. And it basically, if it's full, it's no more salty than the sea. But of course, as it dries up, it becomes fully saturated. And it is often pink, which is, by the way, what, okay, question, why are flamingos mostly pink? Okay. Yeah, there you go. Okay, the little shrimpy things, and others have Himalayan salt. No, but Himalayan salt may blush a lot. Okay, I love the answers. Okay, um, maybe they blush a lot, but well, it's not dye. Okay, there you go. Okay, that must be tagged. It is okay. The Crater Lake one. So anyway, it's their diet. Okay, that's probably a good thing. And what they do is they dine on little red shrimpies and other stuff. But in one of the organisms that it's a blue green type algae or red algae that exists in saline lakes like this. And so when Lake Erie gets low, it looks kind of pink from the air. And there is that Duna Liela Salino, whatever, that produces air. Okay, pronounced like air. To air is human. Um, and it produces beta carotene. Well, it's interesting. The Aussies kind of looked at that, and they started actually getting beta carotene from the little organisms in the lake, and it became a worldwide economic thing, so to speak. In other words, where do you get beta carotene from? Well, you can get them from these little, yeah, good place to grow carrots. Well, I don't think so, but in any case, carrots also with beta carotene. Okay, but also this is a really interesting lake because when it gets full, there are birds that come from thousands of kilometers away, and they don't know why or how the birds know that the lake is full, but it basically supports about a 1% of some of the bird species in that area of Asia, Asia Pacific area. And they don't know how the birds know that the lake is full, but they come from thousands of kilometers away to get to the lake. Okay, and they also have that um, the yacht club. So lots of very interesting things having to do with these lakes. Okay, so the next one is Lop Nur, or Lake, that at one time the lake in 1928 was measured as high as 3,000 square kilometers, making it a big lake. But due to constructions of dams along the tributaries, the rivers that and creeks that went into the lake that were dammed for agricultural reasons and stuff, the lake no longer had um, the lake no longer had. Oh, thanks. I try to make the slides interesting. Okay, even if you're not too keen on the topic, I try to make the slides interesting. Okay, so anyway, the lake was really big in 1928, but then you had dams on the tributaries. Remember that these areas, since they don't have an outlet to the sea, they basically are in equilibrium between the precipitation and the evaporation. And uh, that's what rules whether there's going to be water in the lake or not. So the lake dried up completely. It's got as much as 100 centimeters of salt now. The lake, um, on what? On which point? Yeah, go ahead and put it in there. Okay, in any case. Okay, so anyway, um, this is an old lake. It you can actually see from maps back in Marco Polo and Silk Road time periods that the lake existed for some period of time, and it had a lot of salt marshes and stuff. The only native animal, or not the only native, but one of the native animals right now. Well, Shiloh, that's a good question because as the glaciers melt, obviously you're going to have less runoff from ice packs, etc. And so you're going to have more saline conditions in the lakes. But in the ocean, if the larger glaciers, think Greenland and the Arctic and Antarctica and stuff, then you're going to drastically change the top of the oceans. Now, remember that the oceans actually have a boundary where it's more salty below. The submarines know this. They took full, it's kind of like a bounce layer for sonar. Is the thermocline. Good, thanks. In this case, it's a thermocline, but which is causes that, yeah, halo scene. Perfect. Thank you for the scientific answers. But the idea is that the top in particular is going to be more fresh water in the oceans. In addition to them rising, you're going to have more fresh water in the ocean. That's going to greatly affect a lot of the currents. And so you're going to have a real problem, is the bottom line. Okay, so coming back to Loch Muir is when it became one of the native animals there is a Bactrian camel, not a normal Bactrian camel. This is a local Bactrian camel that is native to this area. But because it was way out in the middle of nothing, China used this area between 1964 and 1996 for its nuclear tests. Um, they actually think they might still be using it for underground um, up until almost in the 2020s. Okay, so the Aral Sea, most people probably have heard of the Aral Sea. It's the one east there of the Caspian Sea, the Caspian Sea being the largest lake in the world, meaning a body of water that is enclosed like that. So the Aral Sea, even though it's called the Caspian Sea, because it's large, the Aral Sea used to be the third largest lake in the world. But the Soviets in the 1960s started doing irrigation projects and basically dried it up. And it used to have sturgeon and a lot of other, not a huge biodiversity, but certainly more than it has now because there's one of the little brine shrimpy things over on the right. And it's about the only thing that can live there, except for there is a Ukrainian stickleback, which is the only native fish to survive it now. Yeah, sturgeon fish, like as in caviar. Um, but it's probably extinct. There's nothing. Well, it's kind of gone. There are now the next one I'm going to show you. I think it's the next one. Oh, the one after that. They've tried to restore some of it, but in this case, this is probably gone. Now, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said it was one of the planet's worst environmental disasters because this was a large lake that used to support human and other life around that area. Now there's really not much there. Well, this one is a human caused one, the same way with the Lac Nord. But the one that I'm going to show you, Lake Chad, is a rainfall pattern one. Okay, so these are both man-made, so human made. So anyway, what I'm trying to show you is each one of these, like Lake Air, is simply a natural occurrence. It's a temple lake, so that it sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. It all depends on the monsoons and stuff. Lake Nor and Lake the RLC are both drained by human activity, and some of them are by climate change. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Obviously it has a influence in the local area. Okay. So here's my gratuitous cat for is Mike here? And it's not really gratuitous. Yeah, Mike's here. Okay. It's not gratuitous, but I was looking at like, oh yeah. In fact, the eyes, if you look at it, one's blue and one's another color. But lovely eyes. Okay, so anyway, Lake Von has a rich human history. It's over in the area near the Mesopotamian area and stuff, and there was a even a Von civilization, Von kingdom, and such. Yeah, this particular one swims. It likes to swim in the lake. So Lake Von is one of the largest lakes in Endorheic lakes in the world. It's up to 450 meters deep, and it holds about 40% of the surface water in Turkey. And, and even though in the winter temperatures are below freezing, it doesn't freeze because of the higher salinity content. And it's been around for a very long time. And they have measured the lake has, in some cases, is it? Okay. Uh, has been um, up to 200 meters more shallow and up to 100 meters more higher, that sort of thing over a 90,000 year time period. But it's but it historically, it's been known for a very long time period in that area. Okay, Lake Chad. Here's the one. This one was simply because it's in the Sahel, which is, if I pronounce that correctly, somebody tell me quick. Um, but it's in the area of Africa between the Saharan Desert and the more equatorial area where it cycles back and forth between being somewhat wet and somewhat dry. And Lake Chad was once one of the largest bodies of fresh water on the continent of Africa. And there's still about 30 million. I love the chat. I could never come up with some of the stuff you guys write. But the historic Lake Chad, back when the Saharan Desert had hippos and stuff and crocodiles, was about the size, a good portion of the UK. That's what you're looking at here. The green section down there, which simply drowns a quarter of Ireland, um, is more recent. It's you're looking back in the 60s. Um, but then it's pretty. It did rebound down in the 70s, and then by 2000, it's pretty low now. There's not a lot there. Um, after Bully, it's hard to read all of what you're writing at the same time as I'm trying to think about what I'm saying here. But in any case, it still supports about 30 million people, both from fishing and agriculture. The problem, though, is in addition to the lake shrinking to nearly nothing, there's also a lot of conflict in that area that's caused significant food insecurity. It's just chatter. That's okay. Some of it's very fascinating. Okay. So now, okay, say this one many times fast. Gadi Gotti or whatever. And I don't know what that and I'm yeah, okay. So anyway, it's probably better known as like the Kalahari Desert, okay? At least the bottom part of it. The officially it's known as that. It's in both Botswana and Namibia area. And Angola, which is to the north of it, closer to the equator, actually gets 3 times the rainfall as Botswana because it's closer to the equator and probably on, I haven't exactly looked at it, but it's on one of the uh, more temperate zones. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. And these, okay. Well, don't say it 3 quickly. So, anyway, Angola gets rain and it dumps all that rain in a little lake, a river. The river doesn't actually go anywhere except for into this basin. But when it goes into this basin, it can create a wetland of up to 150 kilometers across, which comes at a great time for Botswana because it's during Botswana's winter. And it actually creates one of Africa's greatest concentrations of wildlife, which is just north of the Kalahari Desert. So you have these great flocks of flamingos, and you can see what it looks like there to the bottom right. There's these falls or rapids, and then in the river itself. And DNA suggests that a long time ago, well, first of all, a long time ago, there was a big lake, and it was called the Gotti Lake. Yeah, okay. And it covered a good part of that area. And DNA evidence suggests that this is where Homo sapiens began about 200,000 years ago. Now, that's kind of highly contested, but it actually is in Nature magazine. So that's pretty um, verified. I mean, not verified, but at least uh, vetted uh, when the basin had a large lake. Of course, there's other places like that up in Northern Africa and Southern Africa and Eastern Africa that they're all saying that's where Homo sapiens began. But in any case, there's some DNA evidence that suggests that Homo sapiens began in this area, this lake. I always like to find little tidbits of information like that make it interesting and make the science more interesting. Okay, Great Basin of the U.S. People were mentioning the Great Salt Lake and stuff like that. This is the largest one in. Nice tidbit, I think so. Okay, the Great Basin is the largest endorheic basin in North America. It actually takes up a good part of in wood overlaid over Western Europe, take up a good part of Western Europe. And it has the Great Salt Lake, it has Death Valley, lots of good deserts. The Colorado River is kind of the eastern boundary of it. And then the Sierra Nevadas is the western boundary. And it also contains, just like China used their dried up salt beds as nuclear test areas, well, this is where the US did their nuclear testing, hundreds of tests over periods of time back, 50s, 60s time period. And it's also where Area 51 is. So you got you have all those up to the upper right there. You've got all those craters from underground, subsidence craters from underground nuclear tests. It's the parts to the north are cold, the parts to the south are desert. You've got the Colorado River running through there. And the interesting thing is, at one time, the Colorado River actually had a delta, much like the Mississippi, and there were river boats and everything going up the delta. Well, it doesn't even reach the ocean anymore. And it also had one of the world's largest desert estuaries and a lot of biodiversity. Now it doesn't even reach the ocean at all. It's used up well before no UFOs. Yeah, they moved over the Area 52. Okay. And but it does have Great Basin National Park, which most people probably even haven't heard of. It, little national park that was made in 1986 to be home for the bristlecone pine, which is the oldest known living non-clonal organism, meaning there are some, I think it was, there's a tree, it's the one with the white bark, birch or something, and then there are also some grasses which are known to be like 10,000 years old because of the cloning. But in here, the bristlecone pines are close to 5,000 years old, single trees. Okay, can anybody guess? I'm looking at watching my time. Can anybody guess why the national park was created in 1986? Yeah, pando species. Anybody know why the national park was created in 1986? Well, Theodore Roosevelt was long dead by 1986, but good guess. Because in 1984, a graduate student cut down the oldest tree in the world in order to do a project on it, and didn't know it was the oldest tree in the world until they measured the rings and said, "Oops, this was the oldest tree in the world." Yeah, uh-oh. So they created a national park. I know in 1986 in order to preserve the other bristlecone pines that were there. Talk about it. Oops. They could have done a core sampling. Okay, so anyway, now the reason why I did this presentation, and I hope it's been fun. I've got a few more. Did he get a degree? Probably because it wasn't until they finished the research that they found out. Whoops. Okay, I shouldn't laugh. Okay, so I know a catastrophe for sure. Okay, so anyway, the original reason why I did the research here was because of this area here. This is actually for Jackson's. Okay, the picture in my title page with the person standing in what looks like a very shallow lake is the picture I first saw. Yeah, imagine having that on your pieces. So the picture that I saw on the title page with the person standing in the very glassy lake is actually at this place here called Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia. Now, Salar de Uyuni is in a large area, um, rather high elevation. Um, oh, okay. Wow. Now, ChatGPT didn't exist back in '84 either. I like these anachronisms. Okay, so anyway, this lake here, or this salt pan, really, and then it becomes a lake when it floods, when they do have some seasonal rain. It's over 10,000 square kilometers, which makes it the largest salt flat on Earth. Which, when it floods, it becomes the largest mirror on Earth, and so it becomes since it's near the equator, it's the most effective natural calibration site for satellites because it's extremely flat. It varies by less than a meter over the entire distance of the lake, of this 10,000 square um, kilometer lake. So the satellites actually use it to bounce off ways uh, to calibrate their altitude, which that I thought was really cool. And the other interesting thing is you see a lot of pictures there. You see the yeah, use selfies exactly. And so you see the what it normally looks like there with the vehicle driving over the salt there. It also it has a train boneyard, so to speak, because it's got a lot of minerals. And at one time, they used to mine the minerals, but Bolivia put a stop to it, which is good because it has 1/4 of the world's lithium, which we all know nowadays is in, yeah. And so, if people were allowed to just go in and willy nilly, oh, you know what picture? Shoot. Did you guys saw the Star Wars? I was going to put it in here. The Star Wars picture. Okay, the last Star Wars, like episode what is it 9? Okay, where you've got Luke Skywalker, and he comes back and he fools them because he's not really there. That kind of stuff is, and then you saw those vehicles going across the salt flats with the pink trails. That was filmed here. Yeah, it had the salt planet, and that was filmed. That was filmed in this area. Of course, they kind of made big ruts in the salt area. Um, but you have that salt flats, but underneath that salt flats are a lot of the algae that are really red. So if you rip up the salt flats there, you're going to get big red ruts in the surface, and that's how they did with the movie. Now there is some wildlife, not a lot of biodiversity, and not a lot of animals can live in hypersaline conditions. But you've got some cactus, you've got this funny looking whatever critter is in the middle there, you've got the pink flamingos, and then just like up in northern Sweden, I think it is, where there's a hotel made of ice each winter, they've got a hotel made of salt blocks. No, it's not a chinchilla, but it's something like that. Uh, and I forgot what it's called. I should have put the name on there. But you've got this hotel made of salt blocks that you can stay at if you want. Oh, interesting. I love it that you look up these things. Okay, so this is one of the interesting endorheic areas. It's also the same sort of area that you get stuff like Lake Titicaca, that sort of thing. In fact, that's the lake you see over to the west of the A, and other, which has a huge history as far as the Incas and others in that area. Okay, and last but not least, and I wasn't sure how much time I had, so but Lake Bonny. And this one kind of circles back to the very first one that I showed you with the planets. In other words, what is underneath ice? This is Lake Bonny. It's at nearly 80 degrees south latitude. It's got a permanent ice cover over it because of the um, how cold it is in the area. Yeah, it's probably like that. So it's some one of those sorts of critters. Okay, but Lake Bonny, there's also one called Lake Banda in the same area. It's part of an area called the McMurdo Dry Valley region of Antarctica. It's a small lake, only about 1 by 7 kilometers under permanent ice cover, but it's a very fascinating one because it's a saline lake, and there's at least one organism that they found in the lake, and that's this green algae with the flagella there. Um, there's about 150 different species of that. Okay. I'm reading this stuff. Okay. Um, okay. So anyway, one of the interesting things about this circles back to the Europa oceans and such, and to the um, ice, or excuse me, snowball Earth back in the early days before the Cambrian explosion of the Earth. And so what they found was there's a very weird thing called blood falls on a glacier. And so, yeah, it's actually okay. So there's a thing called blood falls. I was going to show you that on a slide here too. But what it does, but it didn't have really to do with what we're doing here. But blood falls actually comes from under a glacier. And it looks blood red, except that it's actually iron is what causes the red color. And so what they what they found is that beneath a glacier, which is next to this one, Lake Bonny, there are organisms that use sulfur and iron rather than oxygen. In other words, it's as if the ecosystem was before oxygen existed on Earth, and the or deep in the sea where they use sulfur compounds and stuff. So instead of using oxygen for oxidation, they use sulfur and iron compounds. And they're using that area and this area here to develop autonomous submersible robots to explore Europa's ocean. So I thought that was great. So essentially we've come full circle. And so if you look back on, let me see if I can get the proper, it's probably, let's see, slide 10. Okay. On here, we're kind of back to where we're talking about Europa's oceans here. And let me see, did I do it before? Not that one. Not that one. Oh, okay, here. So we've come kind of full circle, so to speak, in a counterclockwise from Australia to Asia to Western Asia. There was ROC to Eastern or Lake Van, and then into Africa with Lake Chad, and then down toward the Kalahari Desert and the Great Basin and stuff. Now there are other ones if we had time that I would see. Well, says if I were going to show a dead, one of the reasons I didn't show the Dead Sea was because that one is probably one of the more known areas of endorheic things. So most people know more about that than they probably do about anything else. I have been to the um, Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee is actually very interesting. It looks like a big bowl. If you come from the west, where um, Nazareth is, and you drive in, you actually look down on the Sea of Galilee and the dead because it's below sea level, and so it's surrounded by hills, and it's a big lake at the bottom of a big hole. It's up of a big bowl. It's also not very big. And then if you go down the Jordan River area, down to the Dead Sea, you can then see that it's also surrounded because it's well below sea level, hundreds of meters below sea level. Um, but I think the reason I didn't include it because of the timing, and also because um, what would I put of interest about it? Other than I did have a picture of a person floating around in it reading a newspaper. Oh, the color coding of the map means nothing. It means oh, no, 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 no. I'm sorry. The color coding of the map means everything. Those are watersheds. Okay. In other words, you got the Amazon River area, the Mississippi, it's kind of tan. You got the purple area there over there with the Pacific Ocean. You've got the Arctic Ocean, and that's everything. So all of these have to do with watersheds. Yes, everything's coming apart on Earth, it seems like. No, but African continent for sure is. In other words, Roy, if you look at where the kind of pinkish looking thing, where the watershed flows into the Indian Ocean versus the green, where it flows into the Atlantic Ocean, that whole area is the Rift Valley. I've been there too. And you've got the area up that's called the Afar Triangle, that's up there where it says the Red Sea takes a left turn, Gulf, and where I've been there to Somalia too, in the Navy, ashore in Somalia, um, Mogadishu, and that's where a lot of the Somalian pirates try to capture the oil tankers or other tankers coming out of the Red Sea. The Eastern Rift is splitting all the way from where you see it up there, all the way down to Tanzania, where you've got the by Madagascar there, the island, the Pink Island off the east of Africa, and the lakes, where you got Lake Victoria and Lake Tanganyika, and those are all part of that uh, splitting area. And you can actually see it. It's kind of an interesting area. It's also kind of you could you could do a whole presentation on it, and I might because I've also got little red dots on the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So why would I put okay? So why would I put a little dot on the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea? Anybody? We have 2 minutes. Also, by the way, the Valley of Mexico, where Mexico City is, and where Lake Tenochtitlan, if I remember how to pronounce that, was at one time where Mexico City is now. Yes, exactly. It's all part of the. Yeah, you got India creating that vast Tibetan plateau. Um, oh yeah, I mean we're talking millions of years. It's kind of the same thing that happened to the Atlantic Ocean about what 75 million years ago. Is it anybody good geologist here? In other words, the Atlantic Ocean looked like that Rift Valley of Africa when all of that Pangea was all um, connected, and then you had the split between with uh, Laurasia and Gondwana land and all that stuff. If I have mixed my lands up. Okay, so why do I have Black Sea and Mediterranean Sea? One more minute. Because they are also endorheic basins. Mediterranean Sea 5 million years ago was dry. Okay. Okay, so the Mediterranean Sea was dry 5 million years ago. The Black Sea actually has a salt river that runs under it. It does not mix with the upper level fresh water, and it runs through the phosphorus strait, that kind of stuff. So I think I will make a presentation on that whole thing because it's actually extremely fascinating how all that area, um, which is also affected by the same tectonic forces the Teddy Sea used to be there. Okay, that's my next one. When we have time, I'll do one on that whole area because it's absolutely fascinating. It really is. It's very fascinating that whole about how the Teddy Sea got all swallowed up in the you got that whole area there that goes from the Indian Ocean all the way to the Atlantic and how it all got squished up against it, much the same way as India squished up against Asia. Okay, so any last questions? Otherwise, we'll call it an hour. Or comments, voice or chat. Yeah, Amalok, that deluge there, that's part of where that came from. In other words, the Black Sea. Okay. So I'll include that one in there. Okay, good. That's the best compliment I could get. It's quite interesting. That's what I do these for. I do it for my own. I like to salty. I like to learn science, and so I go through here. But I also like to make sure it's interesting if I'm going to share it with you guys. So there you go. Yeah. Okay. There you go. Science.